He knew they would lose, and yet he still designed the attack that would drag his nation into a war it could never win. And in the quiet spring of 1940, aboard the massive battleship that symbolized Japan's naval pride, a single man sat alone, staring into a future he already understood better than anyone else around him, a future filled not with victory, but with fire, ruin, and inevitable defeat. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was not like the other Japanese commanders who dreamed of glory and conquest. He was different, dangerously different, because he had seen America with his own eyes, not through propaganda, not through arrogance, but through experience, through long years spent walking its streets, studying its systems, and quietly calculating its true power. And that knowledge made him the most dangerous man in Japan, not because he wanted war, but because he understood exactly what war would cost, and still, despite everything he knew, he became the architect of the most shocking surprise attack in modern history. Not because he believed it would bring victory, but because he believed it was the only way Japan could delay its defeat. Years before Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto had lived inside the very nation his country would one day try to destroy, studying at Harvard University between 1919 and 1921, officially as a student of English, but in reality, his attention was fixed elsewhere, on something far more important than language. He studied oil industry production, the lifeblood of modern war, and during his time in America, he didn't stay confined to classrooms. He traveled, he observed, he explored the vast industrial machine that powered the United States, visiting oil fields in Texas where endless rows of derricks pumped black fuel from the earth, watching factories in cities like Detroit where machines and men worked together in perfect rhythm to produce automobiles at a scale that seemed almost impossible. And as he moved through this world, he wasn't just impressed, he was terrified because he realized something that most of his countrymen refused to accept. America was not just powerful, it was unstoppable if fully awakened. But it wasn't just factories and oil fields that shaped his understanding. It was something more subtle, something psychological, something he learned in quiet rooms over long nights playing poker with Americans, a game that fascinated him to the point of obsession. He studied it intensely, the probabilities, the strategies, the mental discipline, and through those games, he discovered a truth about American character that no intelligence report could ever capture. Americans were patient, calculating, willing to take losses if it meant winning in the long run. They didn't panic. They didn't rush blindly. They waited, they adapted, and when the moment came, they struck with overwhelming force. And Yamamoto carried that lesson with him, because to him, it revealed something far more important than any military statistic. It revealed how America would fight a war. When he later served as a naval attaché in Washington from 1926 to 1928, his observations only deepened. He traveled across the country again, studying industries, measuring output, calculating potential, and every calculation led him to the same terrifying conclusion. Japan could not win a prolonged war against the United States. It simply did not have the resources, the industrial base, or the capacity to match American production, and he said it openly, warning that anyone who had seen American factories and oil fields would understand that Japan lacked the national strength for a naval race with America, but his warnings were inconvenient. They clashed with the rising tide of nationalism and military ambition that was sweeping through Japan, and so they were ignored. Instead, Japanese leaders chose to believe a different story, a story that was far more comforting. They convinced themselves that America was soft, that its people were too attached to comfort, too divided by politics, too unwilling to sacrifice. They looked at democracy and saw weakness. They looked at debate and saw indecision. They looked at a nation that hesitated to go to war and assumed it lacked the courage to fight one. And this belief became the foundation of their strategy, because if America was truly weak, then a single powerful blow might be enough to break its will. Yamamoto knew better, and when he was asked about the chances of war, his answer was chilling in its honesty. He said he could run wild for 6 months, winning victory after victory. But beyond that, he saw no hope, no path to success, only eventual defeat. It was not a guess. It was a calculation, a precise understanding of time, resources, and human behavior. And yet, even as he spoke these words, the machinery of war continued to move forward, unstoppable, driven by leaders who believed not in reality, but in their own assumptions. Those assumptions were rooted in history, particularly in Japan's victory over Russia in 1905, a moment that had shaped the thinking of an entire generation of military planners. Back then, Japan had launched a surprise attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur, striking without warning and achieving devastating results. And over the following year, Japan defeated Russia again and again, culminating in the Battle of Tsushima, where the Russian fleet was annihilated. It was a stunning victory, one that proved a smaller nation could defeat a larger one through speed, surprise, and precision. And from this, Japanese leaders drew a dangerous lesson, that a well-executed surprise attack could force a stronger enemy to negotiate peace before prolonged war became necessary. But what they failed to understand was why they had truly won that war. Russia had been weakened, stretched across vast distances, struggling with internal unrest, its fleet exhausted after a long journey. Japan's victory was not just about strength. It was about circumstance, but that nuance was lost, and instead, the myth of the decisive first strike became doctrine, a belief that would guide Japan straight into disaster decades later. As the 1930s unfolded, this belief was reinforced by global events. Western powers appeared hesitant, unwilling to confront aggression. Japan invaded Manchuria, then China, Germany expanded across Europe, and the response from democracies was slow, cautious, often ineffective. And the Japanese leaders, this confirmed their view, that democracies lacked the will to fight, that they would protest, impose sanctions, but ultimately avoid war, and this perception hardened into certainty, shaping every decision that followed. Even when economic pressure began to mount, when the United States imposed sanctions and eventually cut off oil supplies, Japan's leadership framed the situation not as a warning, but as a justification for war. They believed they had no choice, that they were being pushed into a corner, and that a bold strike was their only way out. And so the plan for Pearl Harbor began to take shape, not as a reckless gamble, but as a calculated move based on flawed assumptions. Yamamoto understood the gamble better than anyone. He knew that destroying the American Pacific Fleet might buy time, but it would not win the war. He even warned that true victory would require marching into Washington itself, a statement so extreme that it was later twisted into propaganda. But in reality, it was a warning, a way of showing just how impossible victory truly was. Because anything less than total domination would only provoke a response from a nation capable of unimaginable production and endurance. And still, despite all of this, despite every warning, every calculation, every insight, Japan moved forward, convinced that America would break, convinced that a single devastating blow would force negotiation, convinced that they understood their enemy better than they actually did. And as the final plans were drawn, as aircraft carriers prepared to sail, as pilots trained for a mission that would change the course of history, one truth remained hidden beneath layers of arrogance and miscalculation, a truth that Yamamoto had already seen clearly, that the attack they were about to launch would not end a war, but begin one they could never hope to finish. And on the morning when that plan finally came to life, when engines roared and aircraft rose into the sky, carried with them the hopes of an empire and the seeds of its destruction, everything that followed would unfold exactly as he had feared. Because the moment those bombs fell, the moment that surprise attack shattered the silence of a distant harbor, the world would change forever, and the nation Japan believed was too soft to fight would awaken with a fury that no one could control. And that awakening began with a single signal transmitted across the sky. A coded message that carried with it the weight of an entire nation's gamble. Tora, Tora, Tora. The words crackled through the airwaves as Japanese aircraft descended over Pearl Harbor, confirming what their commanders had hoped for. Complete and total surprise. Below them, the American Pacific Fleet lay still, battleships lined up in neat rows. Sailors go about their morning routines, completely unaware that within minutes their world would erupt into chaos. Engines screamed overhead as the first wave of 353 aircraft surged forward. Torpedo bombers dropping low over the water, dive bombers cutting through the sky with terrifying precision, and fighters strafing anything that moved. The attack had begun, and in those opening moments, it seemed as if Japan's strategy had worked perfectly. Explosions ripped through the harbor as torpedoes slammed into the sides of massive battleships. Bombs pierced armored decks, and fire spread rapidly from ship to ship. The USS Arizona became the symbol of that destruction, struck by a bomb that ignited its forward ammunition magazine. The resulting explosion was so powerful that it tore the ship apart in seconds, a massive fireball rising into the sky, visible for miles, killing over 1,000 men almost instantly. Nearby, the USS Oklahoma rolled over after multiple torpedo hits, trapping hundreds of sailors inside as it capsized, their desperate tapping echoing from within the hull for days, a haunting reminder of the cost of surprise. Across the harbor, ships burned, sank, or struggled to stay afloat as crews fought desperately to respond. But the attack was relentless, carefully planned, brutally executed, and devastatingly effective. Airfields were hit simultaneously, American aircraft destroyed on the ground before they could even take off. The intention was clear: cripple the fleet, eliminate air support, and ensure that the United States could not respond quickly enough to stop Japan's expansion across the Pacific. And for a moment, it seemed as though everything had gone exactly according to plan. Within just 2 hours, the Japanese had inflicted massive damage, nearly 20 ships destroyed or heavily damaged, over 2,400 Americans dead, and the Pacific Fleet left in ruins. From a purely tactical perspective, it was a stunning success, one of the most effective surprise attacks in military history. But hidden beneath that success were critical mistakes that would change everything. Because while the battleships had been the primary targets, the true power of modern naval warfare was already shifting toward aircraft carriers. And on that day, none of the American carriers were in Pearl Harbor. They were at sea, untouched, unharmed, and ready to fight another day. Even more crucially, the Japanese had failed to destroy the infrastructure that would allow the United States to recover quickly. The massive fuel storage tanks, holding millions of barrels of oil, remained intact. The repair facilities, dry docks, and shipyards were largely undamaged, meaning that many of the ships that had been sunk could eventually be raised, repaired, and returned to service. And perhaps most importantly, something far greater than ships or fuel had been left completely untouched: American resolve. The attack that was meant to break the will of the United States instead ignited it. Before December 7th, America had been divided, public opinion uncertain about entering the war. Many people believed that the conflict in Europe and Asia were distant problems, not worth American lives. Isolationist sentiment was strong, and the idea of full-scale involvement in another global war was deeply unpopular. But Pearl Harbor changed everything overnight. The shock, the anger, the sense of betrayal. It unified the nation in a way nothing else could have. Within 24 hours of President Franklin Roosevelt's speech declaring the attack, a date which will live in infamy, Congress voted overwhelmingly for war, and millions of Americans who had once opposed involvement now demanded action. What Japan had believed to be weakness turned out to be something entirely different. It was not a lack of courage, but a choice, a democratic process, a nation debating whether to fight. And once that decision was made, once the attack forced their hand, there was no hesitation left, only determination. Enlistment offices were flooded with volunteers. Factories began preparing for wartime production, and a country that had seemed divided suddenly moved with a single purpose: to win the war at any cost. And yet, even as this transformation began, Japan still believed its strategy might succeed. They assumed that the initial shock would give them enough time to secure their conquests, to establish a defensive perimeter across the Pacific, and to force America into negotiations before its industrial power could fully mobilize. It was a gamble based on time, a race between Japan's ability to fortify its position and America's ability to respond. And for a brief moment, it seemed like that race might favor Japan. But then, something unexpected happened, something that shattered the illusion of Japanese invincibility far sooner than anyone had anticipated. Just 4 months after Pearl Harbor, American bombers appeared over Tokyo itself, a mission so daring, so unprecedented, that it stunned both sides. The Doolittle raid, led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, launched 16B, 25 bombers from the deck of an aircraft carrier, something that had never been done before. The planes were never meant to return. The mission was a one-way strike: bomb Japan, and then try to reach safety in China, knowing that fuel would likely run out before they could land. When those bombers reached Tokyo and dropped their payloads, the physical damage was minimal. A few buildings destroyed, some casualties, nothing compared to the devastation of Pearl Harbor, but the psychological impact was enormous. Japan had promised its people that the home islands were untouchable, that the war would be fought far from their shores, and now American aircraft had proven otherwise. They had struck the heart of the empire in broad daylight, exposing a vulnerability that no one had expected. For the Japanese military, the raid was humiliating. It forced them to reconsider their strategy, to expand their defensive perimeter even further, and to accelerate plans that would eventually lead to Battle of Midway. But for Yamamoto, the raid confirmed everything he had feared. It wasn't about the bombs. It was about what they represented. America was not broken. It was responding, adapting, and preparing to fight back with everything it had. The raiders themselves paid a heavy price. Many crash-landed or were forced to bail out over enemy territory. Some were captured, others killed, and Chinese civilians who helped them escape suffered brutal reprisals from Japanese forces. Yet despite the losses, the mission achieved something far more important than its planners had hoped. It showed the American people that Japan could be struck, that the war was not hopeless, and that victory was possible. And as both nations prepared for the next phase of the conflict, as fleets moved across the vast expanse of the Pacific, as strategies were drawn and redrawn, one thing became increasingly clear. The war that had begun with surprise attack was now evolving into something far larger, something that would test not just military strength, but endurance, production, and willpower. And in that kind of war, the advantage would not belong to the nation that struck first, but to the one that could sustain the fight the longest, a truth that Yamamoto had understood from the very beginning, and a truth that Japan was about to learn the hard way. Because as the next great battle approached, as carriers moved silently across the ocean toward a tiny island that would change everything, the stage was being set for a confrontation that would prove, once and for all, whether Japan's gamble had any chance of success, or whether the 6-month window Yamamoto had predicted was already closing, faster than anyone realized. And as dawn broke over the Pacific on that day, the fate of an empire hung in the balance, waiting to be decided in a matter of minutes that would echo through history forever. And as dawn broke over the Pacific on that day, the fate of an empire hung in the balance, waiting to be decided in a matter of minutes that would echo through history forever. The vast ocean stretched endlessly beneath the rising sun, calm and silent, hiding beneath its surface the most important naval confrontation of the war so far. The Battle of Midway was not just another engagement. It was the moment where Yamamoto's prediction would either be proven right or shattered completely, and, unknown to the Japanese commanders moving confidently toward their objective, the Americans were already waiting for them. What Japan believed would be a carefully orchestrated trap had already been exposed, their secret codes partially broken, their plans intercepted and analyzed by American code breakers working tirelessly in Hawaii, men who sat in quiet rooms filled with radio signals and fragments of information, slowly piecing together a picture that would change the course of the war. Commander Joseph Rockefort and his team had identified Midway as a target, confirming it through a clever deception involving a false message about a water shortage. And with that knowledge, Admiral Chester Nimitz made a bold decision. Instead of reacting to the attack, he would ambush the attackers themselves. On paper, the odds heavily favored Japan. They brought forward their most powerful carriers, the same ones that had devastated Pearl Harbor, along with a massive supporting fleet of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Their pilots were experienced, highly trained veterans of multiple campaigns, confident in their superiority, while the Americans could muster only 3 carriers, one of which, the USS Yorktown, had been badly damaged just weeks earlier and hastily repaired in a desperate effort to get it back into the fight. Everything suggested a Japanese victory, and yet the battle that unfolded would defy every expectation. The morning of June 4th, 1942 began with confusion and missed opportunities. Japanese aircraft launched strikes against Midway Island, encountering fierce resistance from American defenders, while American planes searched desperately for the Japanese carriers. Many attacks failed. Planes were lost, formations scattered, and for hours it seemed as though the battle might slip away without a decisive outcome. But beneath this chaos, something critical was happening aboard the Japanese carriers. Their decks were crowded with aircraft, fueled, armed, and preparing for another strike. Bombs and torpedoes lay scattered across the hangars. Hoses pumped fuel into planes. Crews worked quickly under pressure, unaware that danger was approaching from above. And then, in a moment that would change everything, American dive bombers appeared out of the sky, almost by accident, having followed a lone Japanese destroyer that had broken formation. And in the span of just 5 minutes, the balance of power in the Pacific shifted forever. Bombs slammed into the carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, igniting the fuel and munitions on their decks, turning them into infernos. Flames spread uncontrollably, explosions ripped through the ships, and within minutes, 3 of Japan's most powerful carriers were doomed. The 4th, Hiryu, managed to launch a counterattack, damaging the USS Yorktown, but it too was eventually found and destroyed later that same day. And just like that, Japan had lost 4 carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and, most importantly, its most experienced pilots, men who could not be easily replaced. The loss was catastrophic. Far beyond anything Japan could recover from, those carriers had been the backbone of its naval power, the same force that had swept across the Pacific in the early months of the war, and now they were gone, destroyed in a single battle that lasted only a few hours. Yamamoto's 6-month prediction had come true with almost terrifying accuracy. The momentum that Japan had gained at Pearl Harbor was shattered at Midway, and from that point forward, the war would never be the same. For the Americans, the victory was a turning point. Proof that Japan could be defeated, proof that intelligence, strategy, and determination could overcome numerical disadvantage. And as news of the battle spread, it fueled a growing confidence that would carry them to the long and brutal campaigns ahead. But even as the strategic tide began to turn, the war itself was far from over in many ways. It was only just beginning. Because while Midway had broken Japan's offensive power, it had not destroyed its ability to fight. And the battles that followed would test both sides in ways that no one had fully anticipated. Nowhere was this more evident than on a remote island in the South Pacific, a place that would become synonymous with relentless combat, exhaustion, and survival, Guadalcanal. When American forces landed there in August 1942, it marked their first major offensive of the war, a bold move designed to halt Japanese expansion and begin pushing them back. The island itself seemed insignificant, a small patch of jungle surrounded by water, but its strategic importance was enormous. Controlling it meant controlling vital supply routes, and both sides understood that losing it was not an option. The initial landings caught the Japanese by surprise, and American Marines quickly secured an unfinished airfield, later named Henderson Field. But what followed was not a quick victory. It was a drawn-out struggle that lasted for months, a brutal test of endurance where neither side was willing to give ground. The Japanese launched repeated attacks, by land, by sea, and by air, determined to retake the island at any cost, while American forces dug in, defending their position against wave after wave of assaults. The fighting was relentless. Days blurred into nights. The jungle became a battlefield filled with mud, disease, and constant danger, malaria, dysentery, and exhaustion claimed as many men as bullets and bombs. Supplies were scarce, reinforcements uncertain, and yet the fighting never stopped. Naval battles raged in surrounding waters. So many ships were sunk that the area became known as Iron Bottom Sound, a graveyard beneath the waves filled with the wreckage of both fleets. And in this environment, something unexpected happened. The Japanese soldiers, who had been taught that Americans were weak and unwilling to fight, began to realize their mistake. They faced Marines who held their ground under relentless pressure, who counterattacked with determination, who endured the same hardships and refused to break. The myth of American weakness began to crumble, replaced by a growing recognition that their enemy was far more formidable than they had ever imagined. By the time the battle finally ended in early 1943, Japan had suffered heavy losses, thousands of soldiers dead, ships destroyed, aircraft lost, and perhaps most importantly, the initiative had slipped away completely. No longer could they dictate the pace of the war. No longer could they launch major offensives. From this point on, they would be fighting defensively, trying to hold on to what they had already taken, while America continued to grow stronger with each passing day. And that strength was not just measured on the battlefield. It was being built thousands of miles away, in factories, shipyards, and assembly lines that were operating at a scale the world had never seen before, because while soldiers fought and died on islands like Guadalcanal, something even more powerful was taking shape behind the scenes, an industrial force so massive that it would eventually overwhelm everything in its path, a force that Japanese planners had seen in numbers but never truly believed in, a force that was now beginning to reveal its full potential. And as production lines accelerated, as ships and aircraft rolled out in numbers that defied imagination, the gap between the two nations widened with every passing month. turned what had once been a contest of strategy into a test of endurance that Japan was destined to lose, because the war was no longer just being fought with bullets and bombs. It was being decided in factories, in shipyards, and in the unstoppable machinery of a nation that had finally awakened. And as that machine gained momentum, it became clear that what lay ahead would not be a quick end, but a long and relentless push across the Pacific, one island at a time, one battle after another, until the war reached the very doorstep of Japan itself. And the full weight of everything Yamamoto had feared came crashing down with unstoppable force. Not in a single moment, but in a relentless wave that grew stronger with each passing month, because while battles raged across distant islands, something far more decisive was happening far from the front lines, inside factories, shipyards, and assembly plants across the United States, where an entire nation had transformed itself into a war machine unlike anything the world had ever seen. The same country that Japanese leaders had dismissed as soft and divided was now producing weapons, vehicles, and supplies at a pace that defied logic, proving that they had misunderstood not just America's strength, but the very nature of its society. Before the war, American industry had been focused on consumer goods, cars, appliances, everyday life. But after Pearl Harbor, that entire system shifted almost overnight. Factories that once built automobiles began producing tanks and aircraft. Assembly lines that once turned out civilian products were retooled to manufacture weapons of war. And the scale of this transformation was staggering. Companies like Ford adapted their production methods to build bombers, applying the same principles of mass production that had revolutionized the automobile industry. The Willow Run plant in Michigan became a symbol of this effort, producing 24 bombers at an incredible rate, eventually turning out one aircraft every hour, something that had once seemed impossible. Shipyards expanded just as rapidly. New techniques allowed ships to be built in days instead of months. Workers labored around the clock, welding steel, assembling hulls, launching vessels faster than they could be sunk, and the workforce itself changed dramatically. Millions of men had gone off to fight, and in their place came women, stepping into roles that had never been open to them before, operating machinery, building aircraft, driving trucks, becoming an essential part of the war effort. The image of Rosie the Riveter became a powerful symbol of this transformation, representing not just production, but determination, unity, and the willingness to sacrifice for victory. The numbers that came out of this industrial surge were beyond anything Japanese planners had imagined. By 1943, American factories were producing tens of thousands of aircraft each year, eventually reaching nearly 100,000 annually, more than Japan could produce throughout the entire war. Shipyards launched more tonnage in a single year than Japan could match over several tanks, artillery, trucks, ammunition. Everything flowed in endless quantities, feeding a military that was growing stronger with each passing day. And this was a reality that Yamamoto had tried to warn about, the reality that Japan had chosen to ignore. While America's strength grew, Japan faced a very different situation. Its resources were limited, its supply lines stretched thin, and its ability to replace losses was severely constrained. Every ship sunk, every pilot lost, every aircraft destroyed represented a gap that could not easily be filled. And as the war dragged on, those gaps began to widen, turning early victories into distant memories, replaced by a constant struggle to hold ground against an enemy that seemed to grow stronger with every passing battle. And yet, despite these challenges, Japan continued to fight with incredible determination, its soldiers and pilots driven by a belief in duty, honor, and sacrifice. But even this could not compensate for the growing imbalance in resources and production, because war at this scale was not just about courage. It was about sustainability, about the ability to keep fighting long after the initial momentum had faded. And in that kind of war, America held an overwhelming advantage. As American forces began their island-hopping campaign across the Pacific, the strategy was clear. They would not attack every Japanese position. Instead, they would focus on key targets, capturing islands that could serve as bases for further advances, while bypassing others, leaving their garrisons isolated and cut off from supplies. It was a methodical approach, designed to minimize losses while steadily closing in on Japan, and each step brought them closer to the heart of the empire. The fighting, however, was anything but easy. Every island became a battlefield, every landing a test of endurance. Places like Tarawa demonstrated just how costly these battles could be. In just a few days of fighting, thousands of men were killed or wounded. The beaches ran red with blood, and the intensity of Japanese resistance shocked American forces, who quickly realized that the enemy would fight to the last man rather than surrender. This pattern repeated itself across the Pacific. In the Marshall Islands, the Mariana Islands, and beyond, each victory came at a price. Each step forward required determination, sacrifice, and resilience, and yet, despite the heavy losses, American forces continued to advance, driven by the knowledge that every battle brought them closer to ending the war. One of the most significant moments in this campaign came with the capture of the Mariana Islands, particularly Saipan, which placed American bombers within range of the Japanese home islands. For the first time, Japan itself was directly threatened, its cities now vulnerable to sustained aerial bombardment. And this marked a turning point in the war, shifting the focus from distant islands to the very heart of the empire. The battle for Saipan was brutal, lasting weeks and resulting in heavy casualties on both sides. Japanese soldiers fought fiercely, often choosing death over surrender, while civilians, influenced by propaganda, sometimes took their own lives rather than risk capture. It was a tragic reflection of the desperation that had taken hold, a sign that the war was entering its final and most intense phase. And as American forces continued to push forward, the cost of victory became even more apparent. Battles like Iwo Jima and Okinawa would later demonstrate just how far Japan was willing to go to defend its territory. But even before those final confrontations, the trend was clear. Japan was losing ground, its defenses being pushed back, its resources dwindling, its options narrowing with each passing month. Meanwhile, American bombers began their campaign against Japanese cities, launching raids that would devastate urban areas, destroying infrastructure, crippling industry, and weakening the nation's ability to continue the war. Firebombing raids turned entire into infernos, causing massive destruction and loss of life. And yet, despite the growing devastation, Japan's leadership remained unwilling to surrender, still hoping for a way to negotiate, still clinging to the belief that they could impose enough cost to force America to reconsider. But this belief, like so many others before it, was based on a misunderstanding. Because just as Japan had misjudged American weakness at the beginning of the war, it now misjudged American resolve at the end. Each battle, each loss, each sacrifice only strengthened the determination to see the war through to total victory. There would be no negotiation, no compromise, only complete surrender. And through it all, the shadow of Yamamoto's prediction loomed larger with each passing day. The 6 months he had spoken had long since passed, and everything that followed had unfolded exactly as he had feared. Japan had struck first, achieved early victories, and then found itself trapped in a war it could not sustain, facing an enemy that grew stronger with time, an enemy that refused to break, an enemy that would not stop. By this stage of the war, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Only the cost remained uncertain, and as American forces prepared for the final of the conflict, as they moved ever closer to Japan itself, the reality of what lay ahead became increasingly clear. The battles would become more intense, the more desperate, and the price of victory even higher, because the war that had begun with a single surprise attack had evolved into of endurance, willpower, and survival, and it was now approaching its phase, where everything that had been set in motion years earlier would finally reach its conclusion, and the nation that had gambled everything on a single strike would soon face the full consequences of that decision, as the chapters of the war began to unfold with a force and intensity that would leave the world forever changed. And the nation that had gambled everything on a single strike would soon face the full consequences of that decision, as the chapters of the war began to unfold with a force and intensity that would leave the world forever changed, because by the time the conflict reached its final phase, there was no longer any illusion left, no belief in quick victory, no hope of forcing negotiation through limited success. The reality was now undeniable. Japan was fighting a war it could not win, and yet it continued, driven by pride, by honor, and by leaders who could not accept defeat. As American forces pushed closer to the Japanese home islands, the battles became more brutal, more desperate, and more costly than anything that had come before. Places like Iwo Jima turned into symbols of relentless combat, a small volcanic island that carried immense strategic importance. Its airfields would provide emergency landing sites for American bombers and a base for fighter escorts. But capturing it came at an enormous cost. For over a month, Marines fought inch by inch against Deeply entrenched Japanese defenses, tunnels, bunkers, hidden positions carved into the rock, every forward paid for in blood. Nearly 7,000 Americans killed, tens of thousands wounded, and almost the entire Japanese garrison wiped out, choosing death over surrender. And then came Okinawa, the final barrier before the Japanese mainland, a battle that stretched for nearly 3 months, involving land, sea, and air in a scale of destruction unlike anything seen before in the Pacific. Here, the strategy reached its most extreme form: kamikaze attacks, pilots deliberately crashing their aircraft into American ships in suicidal strikes, a tactic born out of desperation, an attempt to inflict maximum damage, and raise the cost of invasion to unbearable levels. Dozens of ships were sunk or damaged, thousands of sailors killed, and yet even this could not stop the advance. Because by this stage, America's strength was overwhelming, its fleets vast, its resources seemingly endless. The human cost of Okinawa was staggering. Over 12,000 American troops killed, tens of thousands wounded, and for the Japanese, the losses were even greater, soldiers and civilians alike caught in the devastation, entire communities destroyed, families forced into impossible choices. Many civilians, influenced by propaganda and fear, chose suicide rather than surrender, a tragic reflection of how deeply the war had consumed the nation. And yet, even in the face of such suffering, Japan's refused to surrender, still hoping that one final blow, one last act of resistance, might force a better outcome. But that moment would never come, because while battles raged on land, something else was being prepared, something that would change the nature of warfare forever: the development of a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen, a weapon capable of destroying entire cities. In a single instant, the atomic bomb, and when it was finally used, first on Hiroshima and then on Nagasaki in August 1945. The scale of destruction was beyond comprehension. Tens of thousands killed instantly, cities reduced to ruins, and the reality of total annihilation became impossible to ignore. Faced with this new and terrifying power, combined with the relentless advance of American forces and the collapse of its ability to continue the war, Japan finally made the decision it had resisted for so long: surrender. And on September 2, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, representatives of the Japanese government signed the instrument of surrender, bringing an end to the war that had begun with such confidence nearly 4 years earlier. The scene was symbolic in every possible way. American ships anchored in Japanese waters, representatives of allied nations standing together, and the empire that had once stretched across vast regions of Asia now reduced to its home islands, its ambitions shattered, it's broken. And in that moment, the full weight of the miscalculation that led to Pearl Harbor became clear. This was not just a military defeat. It was a collapse of an entire strategy built on misunderstanding, arrogance, and false assumptions. Japan had believed that America was weak, that democracy made nations soft, that a society focused on individual rights and comfort could not sustain the sacrifices required for total war. They believed that a single devastating attack would break American will, force negotiation, and secure their position, but instead, that attack had done the opposite. It had united a divided nation, ignited a determination that would not fade, and unleashed an industrial and military power that would overwhelm everything in its path. 16 million Americans served in the armed forces during the war. Millions more supported the effort at home, working in factories, buying war bonds, accepting rationing, and contributing in every possible way. The country that had seemed hesitant before the war became relentless after it began, proving that what had been mistaken for weakness was actually restraint, a choice, not an inability. And once that choice was removed, once the decision to fight had been made, there was no turning back. Admiral Yamamoto had understood this from the very beginning. He had seen America not as an abstract enemy, but as a real nation with real strengths, real capabilities, and real determination. He had warned that any war lasting beyond 6 months would end in disaster, and history proved him right with almost chilling precision. The turning point at Midway came exactly within that time frame, and from that moment on, everything followed the path he had predicted. But his warnings were ignored, drowned out by voices that preferred belief over reality, leaders who saw what they wanted to see, who interpret hesitation as weakness, debate as division, and democracy as fragility, and that misjudgment, more than any single battle or decision, sealed Japan's fate. Because wars are not won by assumptions. They are won by understanding, by accurately assessing not just your own strength, but the strength of your enemy. The cost of that misunderstanding was immense. Millions of lives lost, cities destroyed, nations changed forever, and the lessons of that conflict remain just as relevant today as they were then. A reminder of the dangers of underestimating others, of allowing arrogance and stereotypes to shape decisions, of believing that what appears to be weakness is actually weakness. Because in the end, the story of Pearl Harbor is not just about an attack or a battle or even a war. It is about perception, about how one nation looked at another and failed to truly understand it, and in that failure, set in motion a chain of events that would lead to its own destruction, a powerful reminder that in war, as in life, the greatest mistakes are often not made on the battlefield, but in the assumptions we choose to believe before the battle even begins. And that is the lesson that echoes through history, long after the guns have fallen silent and has come to an end.